Chapter 88. Ralph Wolf and Sam Sheepdog. No one knew how Inaz managed to escape out of the hotel in Doha City and how she returned to India except Alexander family. Even her husband and lover Joseph was kept in the dark. On the day of her arrival in Bombay, Inaz was made to swear by God by placing her right hand on the Holy Bible that she would never tell anybody, and that including her husband, how she escaped from Qatar and how she returned to Hindustan and who helped her to do so. Nonetheless, she was told she could reveal that top secret to her husband only after the two of them had left India. Inaz understood the sensitivity of the situation and kept the top secret inside her chest and never whispered it to anyone. She knew and understood that, if such top secret reached the police or leaked to the media, some dear persons to her who put their lives in high risk would land in jail. Accordingly, Inaz told Joseph she would tell him how she escaped from Qatar and how she returned to India as soon as their plane would leave the Third World and head towards the New World. Even so, Joseph had to promise not to pass that secret to anyone else and keep it to himself all the rest of his life. Therefore, on that Saturday, shortly after returning from Church Gate, the Abraha family took their luggage and travelled in one of Mr. Alexander's cars to the Chhatrapati International Airport. The Alexanders were the only three persons who followed them to the airport. Joseph had his Ethiopian passport and Inaz and her daughter Grace had emergency travelling documents issued to them by the Red Cross. All three travellers had their landing immigrant visas and air tickets issued by the Canadian Embassy. Their flight route was Bombay to Frankfurt to Calgary. From India to Germany they were supposed to fly by an Air India plane, and at Frankfurt they would travel by Air Canada plane to Calgary City. They were told by the Canadian Embassy upon their arrival in Alberta, they would be received by some immigration officials who would take them to the guest house. They would spend approximately 2 weeks in the guest house before they would be sent to an apartment. The government of Alberta would sponsor their accommodation and other expenses for a period of 1 year. During this year, they would receive free medical aid, legal aid, and monthly financial support. After the 1-year grace was over, they would be expected to work and take care of themselves. As soon as they stand on their own feet, they had to work and pay back the amount that the Canadian Embassy paid for their air tickets. All other expenses and money spent on their resettlement during that 1 year were unrefundable. The only obligation was refunding the money spent on purchasing their airfares. In case the lovers decided to pursue their medical education after 1 year or even before the 1 year was over, then they could borrow student loans and join the University of Calgary. All those wonderful promises and many more were conveyed to the Abraha family through a big letter along with their landing immigrant visas, air tickets, and emergency traveling documents when they were mailed to them. For the first time, since she came to Bombay with her father, Inaz came to the international airport on her own free will without coercion. 3 times, she had been kidnapped and brought forcibly to the international airport. Twice her kidnap was carried out by the assistance of the Bombay Muslim police officers and once by the Muslim terrorists of New Delhi. But today, she came willingly and decided voluntarily to leave India for good. Even so, Inaz's heart was filled with more fear and dread than all those 3 times combined. She was extremely frightened and exceedingly worried that her top secret might be exposed, and hence instead of the promised land she might land in the hellish jail of India. She remembered how she was flogged and tortured before, by the heartless police extortionists of Bombay. Her body still retained the scars of those cruel beatings. She didn't want to go again through those harsh interrogation methods. Inaz was told by Mr. Alexander, the head of the CID who always came for her rescue, was dying at the Breach Candy Hospital. He was in his last stages of lung and bronchial cancer. Therefore, she knew this time, if she was arrested she would find no one to come for her defense and rescue. So, that day, the terribly persecuted Sudanese apostate girl expected in less than an hour, she would either enter the gate of paradise and fly to her promised land, the land that flows with honey and money, or the gate of hell and land in one of the concentration prison of Bombay and become like rotten egg and tomato and die slow and painful death. She might also be extradited again and sent to one of the ghost houses in the kingdom of Tartarus and be raped, beaten, starved, flayed, and killed slowly and painfully by those unrighteous police of Allah. Inaz's fears arose from the fact that she was extradited to Sudan and her name was blacklisted by the second man in charge in the CID department. As we have already mentioned, that second terrorist in charge was a Muslim man. He learned through the media that his plot to extradite the Sudanese apostate girl was not successful. He knew she was strangled in Doha City, and the last news he heard about her, she was mysteriously disappeared and feared to be kidnapped by the Muslim police of Qatar, and most probably she was murdered by them and her body was dumped in a hole somewhere in that Muslim city. He had no knowledge that dead and gone infidel girl was still alive and living in the same city he was ruling as an angel of death. India is the only country in earth that people who hate each other with bitterness and wish the death of one another work side by side in every place, in private sector as well as in public sector. It is like trying to make the angels of God and the demons of Lucifer to work together for the welfare of the society. Just like the cartoon series of Ralph Wolf and Sam Sheepdog. Ralph Wolf repeatedly tries very hard to abduct the helpless sheep and eat them, while Sam Sheepdog always brutally punishes Ralph for the attempt. Unfortunately, Sam Sheepdog was dying of the deadliest cancer in the Breach Candy Hospital and Ralph Wolf was in charge of the helpless sheep all alone when the escaped goat Inaz attempted to exit out of hell and fly with her family to paradise. The first problem that faced the Abraha family at the Bombay International Airport was that they had no police clearances issued by the CID. Somehow, they convinced the airport police that the Canadian embassy had waived that requirements. That first obstacle was rolled away, the police next entered their names in the computer. The computer showed that the Sudanese foreign student Inaz Ahmed Salah was extradited to Sudan under the request of the Sudanese embassy. The reason of her extradition wasn't mentioned in the computer. It also revealed that she was blacklisted. Therefore, technically, Inaz was supposed to be out of India. The police officer was shocked when he saw the girl. He read many articles about her and saw her face many times and the TV was standing before his naked eyes. How did she return to India when her name was blacklisted? Instead of asking Inaz that question, the police officer went and shared his startling discovery with his senior police officers. Consequently, Inaz was immediately placed under arrest. Chapter 89. The Flawless Plan. It was the good man Mr. Alexander who came up with the plan to help the trapped Inaz to escape from her helpless situation in the hotel of Doha. He first shared his plan with his wife. Mary liked the idea of helping a helpless sister in the Lord, but she tried to discourage her husband because the plan involved high risk and also had some moral problems. Morally speaking, the plan required some forgery to be done through bribery and many lies to be told. In addition, there was a high risk of legal culpability. The persons who had to execute the plan might face lawful prosecution if they were caught either in Qatar or in India. Nevertheless, Mr. Alexander argued that they could not fold their hands and leave those Arab terrorists to murder an innocent girl as Inaz. Finally, Mary bit the bullet and acceded. The next step, Mr. Alexander shared his idea with his sister Teresa. Teresa immediately accepted the plan and showed great zeal in taking part in it. She said, for the sake of helping her friend Inaz, she was prepared to go to jail all the rest of her life. After that, the Alexanders discussed among themselves whether to disclose the plan to Inaz's husband or not. They all anticipated that Joseph would stand strongly against the plan because it was going to put the life of Teresa in high risk and also might damage the good reputation of the family in the church. Besides, it might lead to the arrest of Mr. Alexander if Inaz and Teresa were arrested and subjected to harsh interrogations and forced to reveal the mastermind of the plan. According to the plan, Miss Teresa Alexander had to fly from Bombay to Doha and check in the same hotel Inaz was trapped in. She would carry with her 2 passports having the same name, but different photos. The first passport would be the current one Teresa was having. The second passport, which Mr. Alexander would obtain through bribery and forgery, would have Teresa Alexander name, but the photo of Inez. Teresa was having a huge album which had hundreds of Inez photos. In addition to the 2 passports, Teresa would carry one-way air ticket for Inez and 2-way air ticket for her round trip to the Gulf countries. She would also have another ticket which would fly her from Doha to Dubai and from Dubai to New Delhi. From the capital of India, she would travel back to Bombay through Rajdhani Express train. She would carry her Rajdhani book ticket with her. Then and only then, after Teresa was back to Bombay, Inez would use the other passport of Teresa to return to India. But the main question, how Inez could escape unnoticed by the police of Doha who were guarding the hotel around the clock. Moreover, there were many Muslim protesters who made the outside area of the hotel their stronghold. They were eating, sleeping, urinating, and defecating in their well-fortified place. They swore by their Allah God, that they would not leave the hotel and return to their houses until they spill the blood of the apostate Sudanese woman who dared to call their religion of peace, the religion of terror and terrorists. It was the job of Teresa to help Inez disguise herself as a male. Inez had already related to Teresa how she cut her hair and dressed as a boy and ran away from her abusive husband in Saudi Arabia. So, the trapped Inez had to play the same trick and fool the Arab police and the Islamic militants who were waiting outside to kill her. Teresa carried male dresses as well as female dresses for Inez. She also carried with her a pair of scissors and many more tools for the makeup. She had also to give Inez some traveling checks in US dollars and Indian rupees. Mr. Alexander contacted the hotel and booked a room for his sister and paid the price online. Luckily, the hotel was still remained open for the outside guests. Even the inside guests were allowed to check out any time they want to do so. The plan worked perfectly well until Teresa arrived at the hotel and found her beloved friend Inez. She explained to her what her brother and wife had planned. Inez was hesitant in the beginning. She said, if she got caught in Doha Airport or Bombay Airport she might confess everything if she was subjected to those cruel floggings again. Teresa assured her the plan was flawless and God was going to help her in every stage of her escape and return to Bombay. Inez understood that she had no other choice except to take the risk and flee out of that hellish Muslim country. After spending 2 days with Inez and helping her in transforming herself into a young handsome boy, Teresa wished her friend Inez good luck, kissed her goodbye, and checked out of the hotel. She then traveled in taxi to Doha International Airport to catch her flight to Dubai. She stayed for 5 hours in transit and then flew back to India. From New Delhi, she traveled by Rajdhani Express train and arrived safely back in her house in Bombay. On the same day she returned home, Alexander phoned the new Teresa and told her to begin executing her plan of escape. 50% of the Arabs were simple and naive people. Although, some of them were filthy rich, but they were having cognitive abilities of children. Most of them could not read or write. They would tell you no need to learn reading and writing because they had enough money to buy highly educated people from India or Africa to work for them and maidservants from Pakistan and Philippines to serve them. Sometimes, you could find the Arab manager or big boss of his big company signing a contract with thumbprint. A peon or a security guard might be more educated than his Arab boss. Their main concern was to satisfy their physical needs. It doesn't matter whether that sexual urge is satisfied through a female privates or a male backside. Accordingly, that day when the lovely boy walked out of the hotel pulling his small back, every male began to think about satisfying his small third leg. As soon as she stepped out of the hotel, Inez stopped a taxi and requested the driver to take her to the Ahmed International Airport. The cabbie was a Pakistani. He tried to engage his passenger in a chat, but Inez ignored him and remained quiet. She didn't want to talk and expose her feminine voice. Inez was supposed to return to her true identity as a girl as soon as she reached the international airport. Upon her arrival she went inside the ladies' washroom and wiped all the makeup from her body. She removed the artificial mustache and small beard. She also reduced the eyebrows that Teresa added to her face. After that, she applied lipsticks and many makeup. She also used cosmetic brushes and other beauty tools. She applied manicure in all her nails. In short, she emerged out of the ladies' washroom as the most beautiful and hot girl in the Arabs International Airport. The majority of the female passengers were wrapped from head to feet with those coffin-like demeaning black burqas. Although the plan was foolproof, still Mr. Alexander was aware of one hole in it. Through his sister Teresa, Inez was also made aware of it. The passport Inez was carrying had no visa from the Indian embassy or consulate in Qatar, and also had no stamp by the Doha International Airport to indicate that Teresa Alexander had arrived in Qatar. Nevertheless, the Hamid International Airport had a record in their computer that an Indian girl by the name of Teresa Alexander had arrived from India by a visa issued by the Qatar consulate in Bombay. Therefore, if the airport authority questioned the new Inez about the absence of the visa and entry stamp, she should say, she lost her passport and got a new one from the Indian embassy at Doha. Of course, the airport authority were not going to keep Teresa standing in front of them until they would contact the Indian embassy and prove or disprove her claim. At the Hamid International Airport, Inez faced a problem that no one among the Alexanders had predicted it. The police officer who suspected the true identity of Inez was from an Indian background. Instead of searching the passport for Qatar visa and stamp, she searched it for forgery. She painstakingly searched it in and out, hoping to find a slight fault to confirm her suspicion that it was a work of forgery, but she found none. After that, she started to question Inez about her lack of the knowledge of any Indian language. Inez said she didn't learn any Indian language because she was born and brought up in Saudi Arabia. Then she asked her about her fluency in Arabic. Inez said her father was an Indian Christian and her mother was an Arab Christian from Lebanon. Having nothing more to ask, the female officer stamped Teresa's passport in anger and told her to go and catch her flight to Bombay. Everything worked as expected and Inez Ahmed Salah returned to India under the name of Teresa Alexander. However, Mr. Alexander had no clue that Inez's name was blacklisted before she was extradited to Sudan. Had he known that, he would not have taken such a dangerous step by bringing her back to India. He might have arranged a different plan to send her anywhere else in the world except Hindustan. Chapter 90. On being a suspect. Following the events of the sad life story of Inez, we were about to enter a place no one would like to enter except through compulsion. But, before we would enter there, I would like to tell first the sad reality about the jail conditions in India. Those heartbreaking conditions were common in all the jails in the Third World. Whether the suspect was innocent or guilty, he would face the following problems inside the Indian jail. When he was arrested for whatsoever reason, the first problem he would face was the extortionists. Who were the extortionists? They were well-trained police officers, whose duty was to extract the truth from the suspect. They were trained to beat him on every part of his body without killing him. Nonetheless, many times suspects were killed during their harsh interrogation method, which was known as third-degree method. I would rather prefer to fall in the hands of the ISIS terrorists, or the Boko Haram militants, or even the devil himself than fall in the hands of the Indian extortionists. The terrorists might behead me or burn me alive, but the Indian extortionists would torture me for days and sometimes months. Next to the ruthless extortionists, the suspect would be handed over to the doctors to examine him to determine whether he was fitting for imprisonment or not. Anyone who undergone the extortionists' beatings was supposed to be declared unfit for imprisonment, but the doctors, without checking him, would declare him fit. The given reason was that the doctors would bargain with his family later on. If he was from a rich family, he would spend most of his time in the hospital. After the doctors, come in line the guards or the jailers. Those guards would do the least evil to the suspect. Their main task was to pickpocket the suspect of every valuable thing that happened to be with him when he was arrested. For instance, if he was having some cash, watch, chain, and nice shirt, trouser, or shoes, those things would be confiscated by the guards. The suspect would never see them again. After that, the suspect would be either dragged or carried by the guards and thrown inside the jail. The suspect now had reached the end of his journey from the free world to the prison world. Among the prisoners there were some people who call themselves the Watchmen. No one should be deceived by the good name they call themselves. The Watchmen were hardcore criminals and do nothing good except evil. They were those habitual offenders or career criminals who were tried and convicted. Most of them were serving life imprisonment. Wherefore, they lost all hopes in life and their hearts turned into stones. When the guards bring a suspect inside the jail, the watchman would hammer him mercilessly. After that, they would inquire about his offense. If his offense had something to do with money, he would be the object of their interest as long as he was in jail. For instance, income tax, economic, and bribe offenses were highly favored by the watchmen. With their agents outside the jail, the watchmen would make a deal with the suspect's family. If the family refused to pay for their watching service, then their relative would be hammered day and night. Next to the watchman, the suspect would face the problem of bedding inside the dungeon. Each dormitory would be stuffed with 200 to 300 suspects and prisoners. No cot, bed, mattress, or pillow were allowed inside the dorms. Besides that, the suspect had to spend the night with the bugs biting. The last problem the suspect would face was the place of his sleep. There was a good and a bad place for sleeping. The bad place was near the washroom where the suspect had to spend his time in jail inhaling the nasty smell. The prisoners were divided into suspects and convicts. The convicts were those who were tried and found guilty and sentenced to imprisonment term, while the suspects were those who were in remand or under trial. The suspect in the Indian jail sometimes might spend more than 2 to 3 years in remand. During that long period, the suspect was not entitled to receive from the jail authority any clothes, shoes, soaps, toothbrush, toothpaste, and tea or coffee. It was the responsibility of his family to supply him with those necessities. If he happened to be a homeless, a loafer, an outcast or a beggar, he would remain as long as he was in remand, without those basic needs of life. The new suspect would be forced by the watchman to sleep with those suspects who had not taken bath, washed their rags or brushed their teeth for years. When Inez was detained before, during her extradition, she was placed under custody. Detention before charge was referred to as custody. Therefore, she didn't go through all those process. Those who detained her knew her detention was unlawful because she had committed no offense. Even so, they fabricated some false charges and kicked her out of India with the help of her Sudanese embassy. But now, Inez had committed a illegal act by breaking the law. She managed somehow to enter India though her name was blacklisted in every airport and port in the entire country. She was either smuggled herself across the border or forged another identity and used it to return to India. The new head of the CID suspected that the Sudanese apostate girl was assisted in her escape and return to India by some foreigners. He accused by name the American Marines in the American military base at Doha and the Jewish Mossad agents in Israel. If he could establish such connection between his subject of interest and those foreigners, then Inez's life was doomed. Inez's arrest was shocking and disturbing news to the Alexander family. They had never anticipated it or expected it. That day, after they kissed Abraha family goodbye, the three Alexanders returned home with heavy hearts. They thought they might never see them again. In short time, Inez and Joseph became part of their family. They loved them so much and did everything they could to ensure their safety and comfort. Shortly after their return from the international airport, Joseph came with his baby Grace and broke the sad news to them. The news hit each one of them like a heart attack. After overcoming the shock, Mr. Alexander phoned many police officers he knew and requested them to intervene. They all promised to investigate the reason of the arrest, and then do their level best to help. Chapter 91. The Dark Dungeon. Inaz remained in the airport lock-up room until the police inspector who arrested her had finished his shift. Before he left, he filed a charge sheet against her. In his charge sheet, he mentioned that the Sudanese woman Inaz Ahmed Salah had somehow smuggled herself inside the country. He also stated that she had already been extradited to her country of Sudan and her name had been blacklisted by the Bombay Criminal Investigation Department. Accordingly, her return to India was unlawful and hence a crime punishable by the law. After that, the detainee Inaz Ahmed Salah was transferred to a jail in Bombay and cast into a dark room. When she entered the dark room, she could not see anything in front of her. Her eyes were not yet accustomed of seeing in darkness. Nonetheless, her other senses had given her some idea of what was inside the dark dungeon she was dumped in. Firstly, her nose had communicated to her the nastiest bad odor she had ever smelled in her life. It was a mixture of urine, feces, liquor, sweating, vomiting, and bad breaths. Her stomach immediately reacted and vomited every food she had eaten in that day. When there was nothing remained for her to throw up, she began to feel nausea. Secondly, her ears were able to hear many sounds of snoring, groaning, weeping, and gnashing of teeth. This sense had revealed to her that there were some living creatures inside the dark pit where she had been cast in. But, whether they were human beings or animals or ghosts, she couldn't figure out. To protect herself from those scary creatures, she decided to remain where she was standing. After some times, when she became so tired and her feet couldn't carry her weight any longer, she slowly and carefully sat down. Her legs were folded together. She hesitated to stretch out her legs and touch one of those inmates of the pitch-dark dungeon. She worried that creature might get irritated and attack and kill her. She then took out her handkerchief and stuck it to her nose and mouth to protect herself from the killing pestilence she was inhaling from the time she had been thrown inside that bottomless pit. Inaz remained sitting on her feet and hugging her legs for a long time. Her face was resting on her knees. Of course, such a posture wasn't comfortable at all. Wherefore, whenever she felt so much pain on her feet and legs and it became too much for her to bear it, she would stand up for some times, and when standing became painful too, she would sit down again. She had done that torturing military push-up and sit-up workouts many times. She understood that she had to spend the whole night in that dark chasm standing up and sitting down. Notwithstanding, Inaz's physical pain was nothing compared to her mental condition from the time she had been arrested. The first thought, which was torturing her mind and troubling her heart, was that her beautiful dream of flying with her beloved husband and lovely daughter to their promised land had failed. Secondly, the Bombay Police Authority might interrogate her through their cruel torture and hence discover who helped her to escape from Qatar and return to India. Consequently, the good Christian man, Mr. Alexander, might go behind bars, if the police discovered he was the brain behind the plan of her escape and return. Also, her good and loving friend, Teresa, might go to jail, if the police found out that she was the one who flew to Qatar and helped her to execute the plan. She knew the evil and corrupt Indian policemen might torture and rape Teresa inside their interrogation room. Likewise, Inaz expected that she might also be subjected to torture and rape by the same evil policemen. She heard many horrifying stories about young Indian and foreign girls got brutally beaten and cruelly raped in the jails. Inaz determined that whatever the Bombay police might do to her, she would never involve the good Alexander family in her charge. Even if they would cut her body limb after limb and rape her 100 times, she would not drag her friend Teresa and her brother Vijay in her charge. Moreover, she wouldn't allow the Indian police to implicate her husband in her crime. All those thoughts were tormenting her conscience from the time she had been detained at the international airport. The internee, Inaz Ahmed Salah, had been transferred to that dark abyss at 10 p.m. She spent the first 4 hours struggling with her physical and mental tortures. She had still other 4 long hours left before the day break. She began to doze off. Even though, she tried hard to fight her sleep. She was scared of the dire consequences of falling asleep in such dark dungeon. She was finally overcome by her fatigue and sleep. She fell asleep, but she got up quickly. She fell asleep again and at once woke up. She continued to fall asleep and wake up every now and then. Her interrupted sleep like that of a chicken sleeping on a rope or a person sleeping in a fast-traveling car. Whenever she fell asleep, her body fell either to the left and to the right, or forwards and backwards. Many times, when she almost about to fall on her face, she woke up and then she went to sleep again. So, the poor Inez had spent the remaining 4 hours in falling in and out of sleep. At the end, she woke up with a strong headache. Inez began to weep bitterly when she remembered her nights which she spent sleeping comfortably with her loving husband and their lovely daughter in the apartment of the good Christian Alexander family. And also those wonderful honeymoon nights she had spent in the hotel in Goa and the YMCA with her beloved husband Joseph. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, Inez had finally got up from her painful sleeping. She forcibly opened her eyes to see where she had been detained. When she saw the inmates of that abysm, she wished in her heart that they were animals rather than human beings. For they were not much different in their outside appearances from wild animals. Even animals wouldn't be reduced to such miserable conditions. Their faces were disfigured and their eyes were red in color and filled with dirty stuff. Their hair were not properly combed. Their disheveled hair made them appear as mad people. Their clothes were torn and full of dirtiness. Some of them were wearing filthy rags. Some of them were not in their proper senses due to the overdoses they had of either drugs or liquor. Some were literally mad people. Some faces showed they were either untouchable outcast or poor beggars, and other faces revealed criminals. All those miserable creatures were females. They were Indian call girls, prostitutes, murderers, liquor sellers, and thieves. Hardly there was any face among them revealed to Inez it was an innocent. Inez found herself like a lotus that suddenly grew in the midst of mud and dirt. She was the only foreigner. The early sunrays revealed to her such horrible faces. She was very much terrified by their miserable conditions. While she was looking at them in fear and trembling, she started to see some of them were doing in front of her eyes the incredible. Some were urinating, some vomiting, and some doing dirty and disgusting things. She closed her eyes and began to cry. She could not believe her high hope and great expectation of going with her family to the promised land was degraded to such low level. Instead of flying to heaven, she landed in hell. She wished that she was dead and gone than still living and being in such a filthy place. Her heart was filled with anger and bitterness towards the police officer who had arrested her and sent her to such base place. She asked herself repeatedly why she always had to suffer. What crime she had done in her life that she deserved to be punished for it again and again. Inez still hoped against hope. She wished in her heart that she would meet some good Indian police officers who would believe her words when she would tell them that she was an innocent girl. And then they would release her and let her go and travel with her family to their promised land, and all this would be just a bad dream. The hours of the new day were slowly passing one after another like centuries. The morning came and went away, and the afternoon came lingering behind. Afternoon was the most horrible time of the day. The dungeon had no windows. So, it was becoming hotter and hotter as the noon continued to grow. The nasty smell was intensified. The dwellers of the crevasse were sweating terribly. Some were farting continuously as if they were having diarrhea and defecating inside their filthy clothes. Their dirty bodies were producing noxious smell like dead corpses which have been decomposed. In such miserable and unhealthy conditions, Inez had spent the morning, afternoon, and evening. The night was far better for her than the day. For the darkness of the night had hidden from her eyes those scary faces. Besides that, the night had also kept the mouths of those women shut. Since the day broke and those women surfaced from their sleep and drinking stupors and drugs influences, their mouths began to utter the most filthy language that Inaz had ever heard in her life. Those uneducated Indian women knew nothing of their vast culture and great heritage except gutter Hindi language. She heard them saying nothing good except filthy expressions such as mother chut, bahan chut, teri ma ki chut, teri bahan ki chut, shudi ya, sala, etc., etc., etc. In order to protect her morals, Inaz had closed not only her mouth and nose with her handkerchief, but her ears too. Around 7 a.m. of the next day, the hostage Inaz Ahmed Salah started to feel the pangs of hunger. Her hunger, however, had made her to notice some peculiar phenomenon of the inhabitants of perdition. From the time she had been cast into that inferno until she felt hungry, she had never seen anyone of the dwellers of Gehenna eating food or drinking water. She marveled of their endurance to survive without those bare necessities of human existence. She wondered whether those women were kept in the pandemonium to be starved to death. Her doubts were confirmed by the hunger-stricken faces of many of them. Nevertheless, she would prefer to starve herself to death than eat or drink in such a filthy concentration camp. Yet another strange phenomenon of the place of torment, which Inaz had also observed, was to do with the newcomers. From the time she got up from her painful sleep, she was seeing every now and then at least 2 to 3 newcomers were dragged or carried half dead by huge Indian policewomen and cast into Hades. Therefore, when the sun went down that day, the dark dungeon was so filled until there was no room left for new detainees to occupy. Inaz was so worried what would happen if such infilling continued for another 24 hours. She had long time ago been forced to stand on her feet, for there was no place for her left to sit in. Some of the new suspects were dead drunk or drugged. Some were badly beaten on their faces and their clothes were torn and full of blood. Some were not able to walk on their feet and therefore were dragged by the police and dumped inside the place of affliction. Some were having open and bleeding wounds. Some were dying. At 7 p.m., Inaz had suddenly seen 4 policewomen standing in front of the dark dungeon door. One of them had produced a big key and unlocked the door of the bottomless pit. Then those 4 huge policewomen forced their way inside the dark dungeon. The dungeon had no lights. 2 of the female cops had torches in their hands. By then, the dark dungeon had been filled to the brim. To allow such huge policewomen to come in, the dwellers of the cave were forced to gather themselves together. Those unlucky suspects as Inaz who happened to be standing near the wall were crashed against the solid concrete wall. Inaz was now breathing with difficulty. Her feet, against her wish, had been lifted off ground. She began to fight for her survival. She used all her strength to push forward some of those bodies which were crashing her body. Her efforts hardly made any difference. She knew if those huge elephantine policewomen prolonged their stay, she would definitely breathe her last breath and her soul would leave her body and ascend out of that place of agony and anguish. If such a painful death happened, Inaz would prefer it than to spend another night in that horrific limbo. One of the 4 policewomen was having a list of names she was carrying in her right hand. She used her torch, which she was holding in her left hand. She then began to read loudly some names from her list. Every name called, its owner was asked to step out. Inaz wished in her heart that her name was included in that list. She concluded wherever they were taking them or whatever they were going to do to them would be less cruel than spending another night in such filthy grave. The policewoman continued to read her list until she reached Inaz's name. "Yes, ma'am," Inaz shouted. "Step out," another policewoman snapped out. Inaz forced her way out with much difficulty. While she was going out, she heard the same policewoman screaming on her face saying, "Wait a minute." Inaz stopped and turned her face slowly towards the 4 policewomen. When she stood before them, and had a good look at their faces and bodies, she thought they were men in women's clothing. She had never seen such females resembling men in all her life. The 4 Indian policewomen were having big faces, big breasts, big noses, big ears, big mouths, big lips, big hands, big legs, big heads, and very huge bodies. Are you the foreign girl who had been arrested at the international airport? The biggest of the 4 female giants asked in harsh voice. Yes ma'am, Inaz replied. So you are the one who smuggled herself illegally across the Indian border. Inaz knew whatever answer she would give, it wasn't going to justify her secret return to India. So she just remained quiet. Tonight I will make you kiss my feet and pee in your underwear, you dirty prostitute. I am not a prostitute. Please don't address me like that ma'am. Get out, you filthy hooker, the policewoman shouted at Inaz. She then took hold of her hand and pulled her out of the place of ordeal, agony, anguish, and torment. After that, she pushed her inside a police wagon. She also jumped up and seated near her. Inaz knew and understood that, the elephant Indian woman meant evil for her. Therefore, she began to shake and tremble in fear.